Hello, everybody, and welcome to MHTV. We're really pleased to have you with us tonight. We're doing things a little bit differently in terms of our streaming, but hopefully you won't notice any difference. And we're very pleased to welcome our fantastic guests, Robert and Tim, today. But before we get started, let's just go to Dave so that he can explain how you can join in on social media and help us to talk about nursing and research. Dave?
Hi, Nicky. Hi, everyone. So as always with social media, if you want to get involved, you've got a couple of options. One of them is to post a message on the Facebook live chat, and the other one is to post a message on Twitter. All you need to do to make sure we can see that message is to include the hashtag MHTV. And obviously, we'd love to hear your thoughts, questions, comments, or anything else about tonight's episode. Without further ado, back to you, Nicky.
Absolutely. Let's go to our guests. So, Tim, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about you?
Certainly will. Hi, everyone. My name is Tim McDougall. I'm currently the Director of Nursing and Quality at Lancashire and South Cumbria NHS Foundation Trust. I worked with Rob over in GMMH last year, and we set up the Mental Health Nursing Research Unit together. We'll be talking about that on the call.
Fantastic. Robert?
Hi, I'm Rob Griffiths, so I'm a mental health nurse. I currently work as a clinical research fellow in mental health nursing at Greater Manchester Mental Health NHS Foundation Trust, where I lead the mental health nursing research unit that Tim was just referring to there. And I'm also a teaching fellow at the University of Manchester.
Fantastic. So when we're talking about nurse research, what exactly are we talking about? What kind of activities are we talking about there?
Do you want me to go there, Tim?
Yeah, you go first, I'll follow.
I guess just at one level, it's about nurses contributing to research in a whole variety of different ways, so whether that's leading research projects or delivering research, working as research nurses, or, just being sort of engaged and aware of research activities in whatever context you're working in. So I think there's a whole range of levels that nurses can be involved and engaged in research.
Absolutely.
Yeah. We talk about research and development, don't we? And I think Rob and I have talked before how important it is to focus both on research activities, so projects, grants, studies, but also the development of nurses in research, so their capability, their confidence building. So I'm very keen when we talk about nursing and research that we're also talking about writing in journals about practice, speaking at conferences, just taking poster presentations of all the great work that's going on. It's often understated and under-celebrated in nursing. So
Absolutely.
we're really keen to promote that.
Yeah. And I suppose, you guys are going to have some very strong opinions on this, I'm sure, but why should nurses be involved in research?
Well, if I could go first on this one, Rob.
Yeah, please do.
Nurses are the largest professional group in the NHS, aren't they? And they have the most contact with service users. So there's something there about credibility, conviction to speak and talk and write. And there's something too about, again, we talk a lot about evidence-based practice, but for me, practice-based evidence, what is it that nurses do every day in different roles, in different ways and in different places that they can evaluate, report, share, innovate, lead to quality improvement. So many reasons why nurses should be involved in research. Rob, what would you think?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I guess one of the things that occurs to me when you start thinking about, well, why should nurses be involved in research, is just think about with any research, you're bringing a whole lot of values and assumptions and perspectives from yourself in terms of how what questions you think are worthwhile to research and answer. And I guess, as Tim says, nurses are the largest staff group in the NHS, and if that staff group isn't conducting research, there's a whole load of interesting and valuable research questions that just aren't being investigated. So I think nurses bring a sort of unique perspective to research that needs to be reflected in research evidence and research outputs. And I suppose the other reason that occurs to me is that when we're thinking about the relevance of research and conducting research that actually makes an impact on people's lives, nurses bring lots of experience from their clinical practice that can actually make sure that we're asking important questions that are actually going to make a real difference to the care that people receive. So those are just another couple of thoughts to add to what Tim said there.
I think you're right to focus on the kind of quality of care that you can give as well. You know, you can't be a profession if you don't have an evidence-based your practice, and you're not always striving to do better and be better at it and then keep improving it. And I wonder if sometimes there are barriers where nurses feel that they can't necessarily understand research as well as they could. I know in a lot of the new nursing programs, there's a little bit less emphasis on research and a little bit more emphasis on kind of practical doing. And I wondered if you could perhaps tell us a little bit about some of the barriers to nurses being involved or participating or even understanding sometimes research.
Might be worth Rob just describing the nursing academy that was the springboard to the mental health nursing research unit. So Rob and I brought together like-minded individuals in the organisation who had good ideas but didn't always have the tools to take them to the next level. Some lacked confidence, some had been put off by the bureaucracy that surrounds accessing grants. So Rob in particular set up a number of sessions to enable and empower nurses to take that next step and take those good ideas forward. But I think the other barriers that we were always mindful of were those which the organisation creates as well, and for reasons we all understand. But there's nothing worse in having a nurse who's got a fabulous idea and wants to turn it into research but can't be freed up from the work they're doing. Obviously, that is for the organisation to consider and take on board if it wants to develop nursing, as GMMH did at that point to launch the Nursing Academy and then the Mental Health Nursing Research Unit.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think there's certainly organisational barriers in terms of nurses who would like to contribute to research. There's often not a very clear career pathway to support them to develop that side of their role. But I think there is also, as Tim was saying, sort of sometimes a sense within the profession that research is something that's done by other people, or research is impenetrable or hard to understand, and it can be intimidating. And I guess the Nursing Academy that Tim was talking about there was just a real attempt to try and demystify some of the aspects of the research process that can really prevent people from sort of pursuing a good idea they have in terms of trying to answer some really important questions.
We had a couple of false starts, didn't we, Rob? One was we managed to secure some money to fund a staff nurse to do some practice-based research, and there was the interest in it, but because of the nursing challenge of vacancies and the busyness of the wards, we just couldn't release anyone. It wasn't for lack of trying on the part of the managers and the trust. It just wasn't working. So that was a frustration, wasn't it, early on? But that led us to think more creatively about how we do protect time for people, which is why Rob was able to build up the team that he had around him using some grant funding.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think it does speak to our priorities as a profession. When you don't, I don't think I've heard many doctors not being able to be somehow not being able to be freed up to participate in research if they want to. But also I think there's an expectation that sometimes is missing from nursing, particularly the more client-focused, service user-focused bands. There's very much that your first and only and most important job is to see to people's welfare, which is absolutely right. But focusing on people's welfare is a bigger job than just attending to the tasks in front of you, isn't it? It's about having kind of a strategic understanding as well of our profession, really. And it's interesting to see how staff shortages play out in lots of different ways. But I think it's really interesting that your trusts and your organisations have such an interest, because it's obviously something, setting up your research unit has been something that has taken a lot of time and effort. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about that journey, maybe.
We'd love to.
Well, before we do, I wonder if I could just pick up on the point you were making there, Nick, which I think is a really interesting one about how there's often this sort of perception that clinical practice and research are these two separate things, and there's the demarcation between the two of them. But for me, you can't really have one without the other. So if you're practicing in an evidence-based way, it sort of requires you to have an understanding of the evidence and theory behind why you're doing, offering one particular sort of intervention or approach rather than another one. So I did definitely recognise what you're saying there in terms of sometimes there is a sense that research is, stuff done by other people and it's not really for us. But I don't really see how you can practice safely as a nurse without having some degree of engagement with research and the evidence base.
That's a great point.
I think some people are so traumatized by their nurse education experiences, particularly in the final year with dissertations, that they're like, when I qualify, I'll never read research again. You're like, I think we're maybe doing something wrong educationally here. We seem to think it's actually a punishment device as opposed to something that we should delight in, really. I mean, when your colleagues publish something and you've got some understanding of how hard it is to go on that journey, even clearing ethics, even getting funding, all that stuff is quite a task. And for someone to actually get to a point where they're actually able to share some created knowledge and lift all our practice up, it's so exciting. We ought to really make more of an effort to celebrate it and participate with it and be really proud of the work that other nurses do. Yeah. And I think it's weird because we do it in other spheres, just maybe not so much research, which is odd.
No, I agree. And listening to what Rob was saying in your response there, Nicky, there's the active research element, and then there's the practice-based piece around what is emerging as evidence. How can I use that in my care planning? And that's something we were keen to invest into, that in providing interventions for people, that they were interventions that were grounded in some research evidence. So the best example I can think of that, and we weren't responsible, Rob, for taking this forward, but was around trauma-informed care interventions. And care planning becoming much more based now on what's happened to people and the importance of how to intervene. And that's kind of research trickles down into active care delivery. And when Rob mentioned earlier around research that's clinically valid, I don't think they're the words he used, but it matters in practice. That was one of the key principles we had in mind when we set off on our journey, that we'll come to in a moment, that research activities that we would want to support and be involved with would make a matter, would matter at the level of patient care, rather than be back here somewhere and on a shelf. Easier said than done sometimes, but I think the sorts of things that have got off the ground so far, which Rob will probably come to describe in a minute, will give us a sense of that.
There's some stuff there that I want to pick back up on again about how we present research. I can see we're going to be. But first of all, let's talk a little bit about how the centre got started, the unit got started, and what kind of work you're doing, so that people can understand a little bit more about that.
Well, I'll make a start. Rob will come in. So this was a bit of a set of circumstances, really. Rob was returning from his scholarship. And I wanted to, at the same time, create clinical academic opportunities within the organisation for nursing. So we had a conversation. I think that was facilitated by our then, still is actually, head of the Psychosis research unit, which we used as a bit of a role model for how we would mobilise the nursing research unit. So at that stage, we took guidance from Tony Morrison about how we might get that moving. And Rob and I had a discussion. I then went off to the exec team and said, can I have some money? A little bit later, and it was fairly soon after, I was told I could have some money. And then we were on that road to getting something off the ground. But what we were also really keen to do, and this was the other circumstance and partnership in all this, was form good, strong academic links as well. So Rob already had the prospect of a teaching fellowship available, possibly at that stage linked to the prospect of a nursing research unit, but we wanted an academic partner. And at that stage, both Rob and I were working with various nurse academics locally and regionally. So, influential in certainly my thinking at that time was John Baker, Steve Promachuk, both of whom we did work and have done work with linked to the nursing research unit. So once we got that partnership going, we really needed the leader, and that's where Rob came in, really. So do you want to take it from here, Rob?
I feel like a drum roll is required, but Rob, you have to just go ahead without it.
Well, yeah, it's sort of trying to live up to expectations now after that intro. But yeah, so as Tim said, I was coming back to the trust after completing what's a clinical doctoral research fellowship, which is one of the funding streams through the NIHR, the National Institute of Health Research. So I'd gone from a purely clinical post working in early intervention services to doing my PhD, which I sort of finished in 2019, was coming back to the trust. And I was talking to Tim about this earlier on, that I think that because there aren't many clear pathways for nurses who are clinical academics, I think the question about what are we going to do with this nurse that's got a PhD that's coming back to the trust. And luckily, Tim had some really great ideas about what they could do with a nurse with a PhD. So we had, as we say, we had these discussions with Tony Morrison about how they set up the Psychosis research unit, which has been established in our trust for over 10 years now and has been really productive and contributed to nice guidelines. And lots of people know Tony's work and the team's work there. So we used that as a bit of a model, managed to get some funding for my post, and then we applied for what's called RCF funding, so research capability funding, which comes from the NIHR, which meant we were able to not only fund my post, but actually offer some of the other things we wanted to do with the research unit. So part of that was about paying for people with lived experience to contribute to the research unit through public and patient involvement. And we also applied for some funding to release some nurses in clinical practice in the trust for a period of time, a day a week, to come and have us come up with the research unit and focus on some specific goals that they wanted to work towards that were relevant to where they were in their career, into the nursing career. So that was awarded, and just on that point about releasing nurses for secondments, that's one of the things that's been most successful really in starting to build nursing research capacity, because that's always the barrier. The nurses engaging in research, or one of the major barriers, is that people just don't have dedicated time to engage in research activities. So we hope we've had
the will and the interest, but it's hard.
So we had a couple of secondments now. So Alison Dorber was one, who's she's a community psychiatric nurse in the trust, and she spent a day with us a week for several months, was able to put in a pre-doctoral clinical academic fellowship, publish a paper, which are all things which is developing her CV and actually setting up her as a clinical academic in the future as well.
Brilliant.
One of the things, just going back a step, that's come back to me, Rob, is those early discussions we had at the Research and Innovation Committee. And again, in terms of how these things can be supported, we at GMMH were really lucky that there was a medical director who was keen to promote multidisciplinary research, and the directors of R&I were equally supportive, and that was where that bit around the RCF funding came in, because that had been a bit of a breakaway from tradition for the organisation, but it was a real lease of life for us, and it meant that the Trust's R&I committee kept sight on what was happening in the mental health nursing research unit, and was interested in making it work. So again, organisationally at the leadership level, that was really important for us.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see we've been joined by Vanessa. Hello, Vanessa.
Hello.
Hello. Have you got questions for us? I think I can see some coming through on the WhatsApp.
I haven't got them through yet, so I need to catch up on them first. Okay.
I've got one saying, Alan Simpson, who I'm sure you know, saying, just while we're watching and listening to this, nurses who are interested in research can check out the mental health research incubator as well. So that's something to be aware of.
Fantastic resource.
Yeah, good to hear you guys talking about how to build mental health research, capacity and confidence. And I wondered if you guys could maybe just say something a little bit about, because you've obviously got such a lot of experience working, sort of bridging that gap between research and practice that shouldn't exist but does. So what sort of things do you do to actually build confidence and build just people's interest and capacity to be able to engage with that?
Do you want me to go, Tim, or do you want to go?
No, you go first this time. I'll come in after you.
Yeah. So I guess a few things spring to mind. So I guess one of the things we try and do is just keep nursing research on people's radar within the trust. And one of the ways we do that is through, we have a monthly online journal club. But we were graced with Alan Simpson himself recently, actually, whose message you just read out, where we invite not always nurses, but very often nurse academics or people who are producing research that's relevant to mental health nurses to come and present a single paper. And we just have a sort of a half-an-hour session. We're trying to keep it relatively short to sort of make it accessible to potentially people in busy clinical roles who might not be able to get away for a longer meeting. And we just spend a bit of time discussing a paper that's relevant to mental health nursing practice. And we've had all sorts of interesting topics discussed to that, you know, from issues around psychological interventions to physical restraint, you know, the role of the nurse, and, you know, all sorts of interesting topics. So that's one of the things we do. I guess we also just try and sort of be a central point within the trust. So, you know, if there are nurses within the trust who are thinking, you know, I've seen this fellowship opportunity, but I don't quite know how to navigate it or who to contact to start getting the process going, then hopefully they will have heard about the mental health nursing research by now and email me. So I have quite a lot of conversations with nurses and allied health professionals in the trust who are interested in particular funding opportunities. And that often involves just sort of putting people in touch with things like the Research Design Service, or putting them in contact with colleagues who are in academic roles with particular interest in the topic that they might be interested in investigating. So those are a couple of things. Are there other things you want to mention, Tim?
Yeah, a few things come to mind for me. This great question, Alan, thank you, is about the importance of creating time to think and reflect, because nurses are a great barometer, temperature check of what's really pertinent for patient care at one time. And we'll have some fabulous ideas, and even if they're not, you know, ready to be applied to research, they can often be, you know, linked to innovation and quality improvement. So really important for lots of reasons that we protect the space that nurses need to be safe practitioners and to explore their potential research ideas. But the other point that came to mind a lot when I listened to Alan's question was around that confidence issue that permeates through nursing in many ways, doesn't it? But sometimes colleagues just need that little bit of a supportive push to say, no, that is a great idea. You can turn that into a good paper, or you can get up on that podium and talk about the great work you're doing. But some colleagues will need help to make that move. One of the things I've done a couple of times, and we started this with the Nursing Academy, which was kind of active workshops with interested nurses over at GMMH, is co-author publications. So a very junior or new publisher will have a go at writing themselves, and then you know, I'll help, and we'll jointly produce something, because that thing around writing for an audience or making the research accessible in practice terms is really important. You know, I think we've all probably been in that position where somebody's done a dissertation and then says, I want to publish it. It's a completely different style and way of landing, isn't it? And just navigating and supporting people through that process can mean that it doesn't just stay that or only that dissertation on their shelf as much as they're proud of it, but it also can go to that next level of sharing with the world if that's what they want to do.
I think that's one of the things about research that people get wrong, is they see it as a big monolith. Whereas in nursing, you don't expect one nurse to be good at every single thing in nursing. Whereas when somebody doesn't understand every single thing in research, they think that they're bad at research, instead of thinking there are people in this world, and I don't know how they come to be, who are just really good at writing bids. Like they just seem to be able to write them in a way that just gets them tons of money. And you're like, how, what is it you're doing that's shaking the money tree? And when you find that person, befriend them, obviously, get them to look at your work before it goes in. But there are other people who are really good at writing research in a way that they can create your accessible guide. They completely understand what you're saying, and you can learn from them how to say what it is you need to convey in a way that just absolutely is perfectly clear to people who are in practice, or people who are choosing services or thinking about how to work with different issues. And they just make it so simple. And it's really important, I think, as you guys are saying, and you guys are great connectors and ambassadors for research, but this idea about finding people who are good at the things that maybe make you uncomfortable, or that you're not so confident with yourself, and just asking, because nobody's supposed to be brilliant at everything. You know, we're collegiate, we lift each other up with stuff like this. And I think sometimes research can be quite a rough and tumble environment sometimes, and I think it can feel quite cutthroat just because of the way that the funding works. But well, I think in nursing it's a little bit more gentle. I would say. Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, sorry, I interrupted you. I was just keen to comment on that, and I'm sure I won't mind me saying this, that, you know, as experienced as Rob's become, and you know, having made grant applications, I could see that at times, you know, it was a difficult process. Do you know, when's it going to come off? And I imagine we lose a lot of people.
Still a difficult process now, but yes, perhaps not as difficult as initially. Yeah.
But I imagine there'll be a lot of people that are put off because they fall, you know, forgive me for putting it like that, but they fall at that first hurdle and think, well, that's not for me, I can't do it, it's too much. And, you know, we've worked with people, haven't we, Rob, that have had those knockbacks. And that's part of the support and encouragement too, to get them back in the saddle.
Yeah, and I suppose just going back to, you know, I talked before about people having conversations with me about being interested in applying for research funding and looking at funding options. I guess that's one of the really useful conversations to have at the outset is lots of grant applications get rejected, and that's a normal part of the process. And, you know, lots of papers when you submit them to a journal will get rejected, or you know, come back with a huge amount of critical comments. And part of the process is, I don't know if getting used to it is the right way of putting it, but expecting it and learning to roll with it a little bit.
It is. And it's perfectly all right to say to everybody, look at what they wrote, look at what the second reviewer wrote, I hate this person, they're the worst. And then to stop, get over it and get back in the saddle, because often, whilst it is incredibly painful to read, you know, comments that you've tried so hard, when you've tried so hard to make something right, to hear that it's not what people think you should have written, it is really difficult. On the other hand,
you can't stay cross a review or two forever, can you?
No, at some point you've got to take on board, like, a couple of the things they said were relevant, and the rest of it, just track them down. No, don't. And it's just about taking it on the chin a little bit. And I think if people aren't aware of what the process is, it feels quite shocking. And even things like ethics taking so long can be quite baffling to people if they're not used to it, if they don't understand that that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
There's something too for me about networking as well. You know, I don't claim to be a researcher in any way. You know, I am. It's almost by proxy for me. I take pleasure from supporting others to do it, and I admire my colleagues for all the work they do. But all the heavyweights out there, yourself included, Nicky and Alan and others. You know, we've mentioned John. I've you know, I've lots of time with John. I think his ethics and his values, his research ideas are fabulous. But it's staying close to these people as well and learning from them. I remember John early on to me said, "Don't forget about research." When I was making points about strategy and policy, and he's absolutely right, because unless you have the research to underpin it, then it won't move along.
Yeah, I mean, just to comment on that, I think it's sort of impossible to, you know, sort of overestimate how useful it is to have mentors when you're starting to think about research. And you mentioned John Baker, who's been incredibly helpful and supportive to the Mental Health Nursing Research Unit, and was involved in. He was a co-applicant on one of the first bids that we got awarded. But also people like Professor John Keating, Professor Karina Lovell at the University of Manchester, who, were co-applicants on the original bid to set up the nursing research unit. Nursing research unit.
And I think all those people, Rob, have allowed us newbies, as it were, to, they've been our coaches and guides, haven't they? As we've got those early publications through, or the grants in the bag, it's been through guidance from our peers, if you're not our peers, our mentors in that way.
Yeah.
Vanessa, do you have any questions, anything you want to talk about in terms of research and nursing?
Yeah, sorry, I was late joining the conversation, everyone. So if I'm repeating anything, then I apologise. There's a question come through about the journal clubs that you were mentioning before, and I think it's a really important point. It's about how do we release clinicians to be able to get away for even something such as a journal club, and whether you've got any tips around protecting time for nurses.
I mean, it's a real challenge, isn't it? And I suppose the tips I would have are, I suppose the approach we took was to actually try and buy nurses time out to enable them to engage in research when they want to actually pursue research as a sort of a substantial part of their role. But lots of nurses, that's not the route they want to go down, and but they might want to still remain very engaged in research. And I think it's incredibly challenging to kind of carve out that time to do things like go to a journal club for half an hour. Can feel like a real pressure if you're on a busy ward, and perhaps the staffing levels just wouldn't allow you to get away for half an hour to do that. I think that's where the organisational support becomes so important, and the messages from senior leadership within organisations saying that actually this is important. This is an important part of your role, and supporting nurses to pursue that aspect of their job.
So you've tweeted stuff out about it as well. Is it possible that people could join in after the fact by just looking at the stuff that you've done and actually joining in online a little bit?
Well, I guess one of the things we thought about is maybe recording the journal clubs and making those available to people. I guess there's a balance there between whether that might make people feel slightly more inhibited about the conversation they have within the journal club if they knew that it was going to be publicly available afterwards. But I guess that's one of the things we're thinking about, because it is hard sometimes for people to get to those meetings as they happen live.
Yeah, maybe just summarise it. Approach as well to it, with some of it recorded and some of it not recorded, so that people have an opportunity. That would be interesting. I think there is something there as well about demystifying nurses being involved in research, because I've through the work I've done, particularly on social media, I seem to have sat in both camps, clinical sort of leadership and research at times. And I think that, researchers and nurses who are clinical we need to kind of bridge the disconnect more. I think, I speak to a lot of nurses who have imposter syndrome, who don't feel that they're clever enough, don't feel that they've got the skills to get involved in research. And yet, they're the people who are delivering care. They're the people who can provide more, clinically relevant research than anybody else, but maybe don't have the research skills. Yeah. And the other thing, I guess that's a comment rather than a question. But the question within that for me is about diversity as well. How do we diversify, in terms of ethnicity and gender in research? Because I think, I've had a lot of conversations recently about that, and about the kind of lack of representation within research from, the groups. And certainly there's, a lot of male researchers in this space compared to females. And how do we change that?
I think it's a good point. I mean, I did want to dive in there and just sort of go back to the earlier point you mentioned. Would that be all right to just do that?
Of course,
you're talking about sort of nursing research being impenetrable, and kind of, and it was sort of occurring to me that I think sometimes when we think of research, we think of, someone sitting there with SPSS, crunching a load of numbers or writing a paper. But I was actually involved in delivering a research methods course through our recovery college this week for people who lived experienced mental health problems and clinicians who perhaps haven't had any experience in research before. And I guess one of the things that struck me, particularly when we were talking about we were covering qualitative research and conducting interviews, was just how much common ground there is between, what you would consider good nursing skills and the capacity to conduct a really good qualitative interview with someone about a really sensitive subject, and just all the skills that nurses do bring to that aspect of the research process.
Yeah, I agree. It's really important.
Something for me about, as just going back to the organisational support point that Rob made as well, that this is about workforce recruitment and retention as well. It's about safety and it's about job satisfaction. So Rob mentioned the importance of it being part of the trust strategy. Well, there's not a mental health trust in the country that doesn't need to keep and attract new nurses. So being able to do different things as busy as it can be and demanded on the front line in particular, it is important that we create these spaces. And this kind of method, the Teams world, has taken us one step closer to being more nimble-footed, if you like, in engaging people across big geographical footprints. But you're absolutely right, Vanessa, and whoever posted the question's absolutely right, that it can feel that some people are just not able to access these opportunities. And again, that's for the managers and the directors to think about and enable so that they can. The other thing that comes to mind for me is around how we need to take research out to people. So a good example of this is some research that Rob and others, I was on the edge of, to do with self-harm in children that has just been done. Well, we decided that we needed a staff nurse to get actively involved in that, for that part of the research to go on to the next level. So we went out for that ask rather than saying, can we start from scratch and get a nurse to help us access this research? So it was a bite-sized chunk, if you like, for the managers to agree with. They knew that it was time limited. They could see opportunities to backfill and the opportunities for them as a service for being involved in something like that. So there are ways to do it. It's not easy by any means.
Yeah,
absolutely. So I can see the time's got away from us again. Sorry, guys. And we've been talking 40 minutes. But one of the things we wanted to particularly look at was this idea of what clinicians can do to practically get engaged and to join in with research. I wonder if you guys had any thoughts on that.
I mean, I suppose just looking for research that's relevant for the area that you're working in and trying to keep on top of developments in that area. I guess it sounds like you have people that are using social media to engage with this. This platform. I guess platforms like this are very useful. I guess things like Twitter and following researchers who are covering topics that you're interested is one way of just staying engaged with developments in that area. Seeking out where you can, making contact with academics. I've always found that when I approach people and say, I was really interested in your paper, they're absolutely delighted to hear from you. And that's led to some really fruitful collaborations as well. So I think having a bit of confidence to sort of reach out to people that are looking at topics that you're interested in is a really great way of trying to learn more about particular subject matters.
Absolutely. Yeah. Tim, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, for me, I think there's that part of always trying to keep some space as well. No matter how busy your working week is, half an hour, just each week, just to go on the internet, visit the pages where you'll find the evidence emerging, read a paper, share it with your colleagues. I think that just keeps people in touch and can feel a bit of a change from answering the emails as well. But, they don't go away, do they? But it can bring some balance to a busy working week.
I suppose things like, the mental health resource is another great way of sort of getting condensed versions of papers, critically analysed and sort of presented in a really accessible way. So, and that could be quicker than trying to read a whole academic journal on the topic.
Absolutely. Vanessa, is there anything that you wanted to sort of think about as we're coming to an end here?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't got long now, but I guess that last point's an important one about not just how we get nurses involved in research, but also once research is done, how do we make sure it's impacting on practice? I think that's, you know, somewhere where there's work to be done, isn't it, really?
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's lots of things about how we present information to people. And we're getting, you can see all across all of research, it's a game that's shifting faster and faster and faster. And I think almost researchers are sometimes being caught a little bit on the hop because they're being asked to present an easy read guide, a guide that impresses their colleagues, a guide that's going to get some kind of funding on the back of it, and then publish in a clinical journal as well. But the things that I think people can do that are really helpful are to just talk about the research in a very open and simple way, and remember who your audience is, because at the end of the day, everything we should do as mental health nurse researchers should be to make things better, should be to improve practice, support service user recovery and nursing practice to be as good as possible, to support our profession to keep improving. And those are the people who really need to be thinking about in terms of being accessible to. And if you're not, then get some support to be more accessible. And I mean, I don't want to come back to things like infographics and dance your PhD. I don't know if you danced your PhD, Rob.
I've not danced it yet, but you know, there's still time, I think.
just things that make your information available and examples of how it can be used. That makes such a difference, because we learn by stories, don't we? We learn by case studies, things that are really applied to practice or what breaks those barriers down. And so I think there's a lot to be said around, it seems to me that a lot of the things you guys are talking about are about knowing that this is your part of your job and actually trying to love it as well, instead of being sort of worried or frightened of it, but also thinking about how you can participate in different ways, but from reading other people's work to telling other people about it. But I think one of the things that Tim said that really struck me is that sometimes we put so much emphasis on nursing on practically doing things like doing tasks. We don't remember that you need to give yourself time to think, properly time to think. And that takes ages sometimes for you to, and time by yourself to actually really think about something and come up with good ideas, or just to clarify what it is that you want to do. And in nursing, we need to support each other a bit more to have time to think, instead of just constantly being reactive. That for me is what I thought was really interesting today as well. So we have tweeted out book club, the journal club, and we have tweeted out the website as well. But guys, if you have any questions, please do feel free to put them on Facebook Live or on Twitter, and we'll sort of circle back to them in the next couple of days. So just before we finish up, is there anyone else who wanted to just make a last call to action or talk about clinician engagement, or any last thoughts on research?
Well, I'd endorse how you concluded the session there, Nick, and all the messages you were trying to get across. I think that's a great way to end the session. I suppose, if you know, we've talked a lot about the journal club. If people want to come along, they're very welcome to it. It's open to everyone. If anyone would like to present a paper, we're also very keen to hear from people. So if you have a paper that you've authored that you think would be of interest to mental health nurses, then do get in touch and let us know. We'd be delighted to hear from you.
Brilliant. Tim, anything else, or just a good night?
Similarly, really, I think I hope everybody's taken something from this. And early on in the nursing academy, we had the idea of pledges and what will I do next, and some of those ideas took off with support from more experienced researchers over at GMMH. But maybe encouraging colleagues who are listening to take forward any ideas they've got and make them work. Look out for the help. Stick at it. You'll get there.
Yeah, brilliant. Vanessa, was there any last words from you?
No, thank you. Just a lot to reflect on, really.
Absolutely. So guys, as I say, if there's anything that you want to come back to the guys and ask about, please do. Otherwise, thank you very much for spending time with us today, and good night, guys. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.